So my name is Eliazer Kramer. This presentation will focus on some of the differences between virtual orchestration and, for want of a better term, real orchestration. After discussing what virtual orchestration is and when it's used, I'll touch on how its compositional process differs from composing for real orchestras, what's unique to both settings, and finally, I'll suggest ways that one may be able to develop virtual orchestration's aesthetic and enhance its artistic merit. The material explored in this presentation represents the backbone of my doctoral pursuits in music composition at the University of Montreal. Due to time constraints, I have to be brief with some of the audio examples, and I suggest that everybody wears headphones. One moment. I'm having, an issue. I see. So, what is virtual orchestration? In short, virtual orchestration is the practice of creating an orchestration or orchestral composition in a digital audio workstation, or DAW. Note that this isn't the same thing as having automatic playback generated from a notation program such as Sibelius or Dorico. Virtual orchestration, at least for the purposes of this presentation, is done within a DAW with the musician manually controlling various parameters of the virtual instrument with a MIDI controller. To demonstrate this, I'll show an example of me playing a virtual trumpet while controlling some of its parameters. Unfortunately, the video doesn't show my left thumb, which is responsible for manipulating the dynamics. So, as you may have seen, in the first part of the video, I was controlling the dynamics and the vibrato intensity with the faders, while in the second part, I also added a mute and controlled the flutter tongue intensity. Apart from this, composers will also tweak these parameters, edit new ones, manipulate the tempo, ensure that each instrument sits properly within the virtual room, and refine the pieces through other processes like EQ and compression. Virtual orchestration is most often used in film, television, and video games. A large reason why it's sought after is because it's a much cheaper alternative to recording a real orchestra. In film, even when the intention is to record a real orchestra, mock-ups will generally be used to show the director the different cues. And they've come to expect for the mock-ups to really give an impression of a real orchestral performance now. So how realistic is virtual orchestration? While the answer really is that it depends for a number of reasons that we'll touch on shortly, we can take a look at one of the few studies made on the subject to give us a bit of insight. The study Replacing the Orchestra, the Discernibility of Sample Library and Live Orchestra Sounds shows that out of a pool of 602 people, 72.5% of them could correctly distinguish between excerpts of a real recording and a virtual simulation of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. While this may seem like bad news for all the virtual orchestrators out there, we should note that composers and conductors or orchestra musicians scored relatively high, about 82% and 78% respectively, while those with what the study describes as lower listening expertise, that's to say non-musicians, amateur musicians, and I hate to say it, but music teachers and musicologists scored much lower, 68.6%. Let's not begin to imagine what the total score would have been had there been a category for singers, but I digress. The study concludes that orchestral samples will be used more frequently in music productions for economic reasons because the group representative of the majority of music consumers was nearly unable to distinguish between the two versions. While this may seem like a harsh conclusion, the study bases this on the Turing test, in which a score of 70% or higher is needed for a convincing simulated performance. I have some examples of the simulations used for this study, but I can't show the recording of the real orchestra. The orchestral simulations for the study were prepared by Andreas Oszewski. An interesting thing is that in preparing them, they sought feedback from 3 conductors, and after listening to each version of the simulations, the conductors offered feedback as if they were listening to a rehearsal of the piece. The simulation was finalized once the conductor stopped offering feedback. So here are a few examples. All of these were created using the sample library, Vienna Symphonic Library. They're quite impressive, I think. I like to think that I can tell the difference between them and real recordings, but then again, I'm biased because I didn't take part in this experiment and I know what I'm listening to. I'm able to show you a comparison of a real recording and a virtual orchestration of an excerpt of one of my compositions. While it's pretty obvious which recording is the real orchestra, I think the comparison sheds some light on some of the issues with virtual orchestration. When listening to the examples, try to focus on the expressivity of the strings and the solo lines, particularly that of the clarinet. Whereas in the simulated version, the phrasing is essentially composed of an increase and decrease of dynamics. The real recording is marked by subtle changes in timbre, a larger sound, and a greater overall clarity. So the second example was the real recording, while the first was a simulation.
Real orchestra versus virtual orchestra. Round 1. Compositional process.
In this first matchup between the orchestras, I'm going to talk about some of the basic differences regarding compositional process. For a real orchestra, one composes with pen and paper or notation software. Whereas, as mentioned, for the virtual one, we write in a DAW, and notes are inputted with a MIDI keyboard. While it's true that this isn't always the case, it's the most common method. Likewise, dynamics and expression markings are written in the score for real orchestras, while they're inputted via a MIDI controller or by manually editing the parameters in the DAW. For real orchestra, you can have all sorts of contemporary techniques and innovation. One of the great things about writing and working with actual players is that we can create original soundscapes and experiment with and even create new techniques. But in the virtual orchestra, this isn't the case. If it's not in your sample library, you can't do it. Real orchestra has the possibility for improvised passages. For the virtual one, aleatoric samples do exist, but I find that they tend to be hard to fit into pieces, and they also may be recognizable from one piece to another, which kind of defeats their purpose. The composer is often the engraver and the copyist for the real orchestra, whilst for the virtual one, the composer is also the trinity of performer, conductor, and sound engineer. Finally, for the real orchestra, one composes for the sound one wishes to hear, whereas for the virtual one composes for the sound one can convincingly produce. This last point is what I find to be the most significant difference between the two forms of composition, and also the most frustrating in my experience. To expand on that, success at virtual orchestration does not only depend on one's composition or orchestration chops, but also on the sample libraries at one's disposal. This means that if one wants to write extremely expressive music, but one's samples do not contain many different dynamic levels, it's going to be a problem. Likewise, as mentioned, if you want a certain technique or extended technique, but it's not in your library, you just can't do it. Going further, some instruments lend themselves better to virtual orchestration than others. Think of the prevalence of percussion and short string articulations in any action trailer that you've seen in the past 10 years. Inversely, other instruments do not lend themselves well to virtual orchestration. As mentioned, well, for the reasons I mentioned when showing the excerpt of my piece, I find that some solo instruments don't translate well into the virtual setting because the expression and the huge amount of timbral variety that can be heard in a solo melody gets lost. Building on that, certain musical patterns tend not to work well. These are important things to keep in mind when virtual orchestration is being used to propose music to a director. For instance, the American composer Jonathan Price says, in the case of the woodwinds, if there are a lot of real dense runs, a lot of times, no matter how you finesse it, it's just not going to sound as nice on a synthesizer. So sometimes we'll drop those. Christoph Beck, the composer for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, says, "You can't write for the orchestra and then mock it up. You really have to write for the limitations of the sounds you have." Lastly, to make a convincing virtual orchestration, one needs to understand the subtleties of expressive human performance and how they're manifested in solo playing and how they translate into ensemble playing.
Real orchestra versus virtual orchestra. Round 2. Inherent differences.
In this second matchup, we'll be looking at some of the inherent differences between the two orchestras and their implications. With a real orchestra, players can react, adjust timbre, and blend in real time. This isn't the case with virtual orchestras. Real orchestras, in a real orchestra, the resonations of two acoustic instruments in the same room interact with each other, and this doesn't occur with two separately recorded samples coming from speakers. For real orchestras, sounds produced from your instrument, and we're talking about the concert hall here, it comes directly from the instrument, whereas in the virtual orchestra, it comes from speakers. Humans are imperfect. There's going to be slight variations in pitch and timing, and when these aren't too excessive, they give character to passages. With virtual orchestras, you need to simulate humanization. While it can be done, it's never going to be quite as convincing. So an example is that string players playing in legato will always overlap since no two attacks will and release on a given note will be the same, etc. Finally, for real orchestras, everything must be playable, while for virtual orchestras, the virtual players don't get tired and they don't need to breathe. There's no dependence on idiomatic writing and playability. This last point, as obvious as it seems, allows for a whole new world of expressivity by means of the virtual orchestra. Why should we only use it as a substitute for the real thing when its very nature allows for so much that's unavailable to its counterpart? Instead, why not exploit this and develop an aesthetic that's unique to virtual orchestras so that it's more than just a cheaper alternative to the real orchestra? On a practical and professional level, what I'm suggesting here only applies to when virtual orchestration is meant to be the final product and not just the pit stop between the composer's studio and the recording studio. In the case of human playability, in this case, human playability is not an issue, and so we can begin by writing unplayable passages. These passages can be beyond human capacity in the sense of technical difficulty, or they can go past what's humanly possible in terms of breadth, endurance, and even something like hand size. We can also write passages that are impossible due to the nature of the instruments. For instance, we can write dynamics that go beyond an instrument's expressive palette. Similarly, we can reverse the registral roles of instruments. We can finally hear a flute project in its lower register over a sea of brass. We can also improve certain instruments and finally have a fully chromatic harp. Lastly, we can also write music that is so impractical that it would never be played by a real orchestra. For example, the company ATO's Legion series includes libraries with 66 trombones, 66 celli, 66 tubas, and more. All of these things would lead us to textures that are not realizable with a real orchestra. Another question that I think is worthy of exploring is how writing for the virtual orchestra in this way may affect one's writing for real orchestras. If we take this a step further and orchestrate our virtual orchestrations for the real orchestra, we'll likely be faced with a number of unique orchestration-related problems that may help expand our creativity by encouraging us to re-examine what's possible for a real orchestra. For instance, how do we deal with unplayable passages? Although this may seem a bit far-fetched, can this kind of issue push us to expand what's playable or redefine what's idiomatic for an instrument? Similarly, what new orchestrator-related problems occur when adapting virtual orchestra textures for the real orchestra? Can this push us to discover new textures for the real orchestra? To demonstrate some of the unique issues that arise when going from the virtual to real orchestra, I'll share a real-life experience with you. I'll begin by playing an audio clip that's an excerpt of one of several pieces from a video game that I was asked to adapt to real orchestra for an upcoming concert. The music was written by the composers at Vibe Avenue, that's François-Xavier Duprat and Mathieu Lavoie. Take a listen and pay attention to the col legne on the strings. So you may have noticed that the col legne passages come out as quite strong, regardless of the presence of the brass and the fact that some of the strings are also playing arco, which would mean that the string section would have to be divided. While this sounds and works wonderfully in this setting and in the game, it would cause a problem when performed by a real orchestra, especially the small one that I was supposed to write for. My solution for this was to have the bass drum play the col legne rhythm with root sticks and the snare drum to play on the rim. So it's this over here. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to confirm if this solution worked as intended because of COVID. And even though it's nothing groundbreaking, I think it's still an example of a unique problem that I would likely not have been faced with in any other context. To finish off here, I'm just going to discuss how this relates to my doctorate in composition, so research creation. To better understand and further research the limitations of the virtual orchestra, I'll create MIDI mockups of pieces that I have written for real orchestra. In these pieces, I have purposely written, and I'll continue to write passages that I don't expect to work well in the virtual setting. I'll also explore why. For instance, here's an example of a piece I wrote last autumn. I don't expect this to work well at all for the virtual orchestra because it's such a chaotic texture. And part of that really depends on, it's a fast tempo here, part of that depends on sort of the nervosity of the musicians and also that nothing's going to be completely in time, no matter how you try. And even if it were, when it's played by real musicians, there's going to be a certain blend, growth and decay in it that I don't think is going to really be accurately represented by the virtual orchestra because of its accuracy. At least not without a lot of editing. Here's another example from the same piece, a section that was inspired by Farben, by Schoenberg. So here I'm exploring different timbral combinations and different blends with instruments. And as I mentioned before, I find at least that this is a particular weakness of the virtual orchestra. And so I expect that this will thoroughly sound bad for the virtual orchestra, even though I think it's quite a nice texture when played by a real one. So when possible, I'm going to compare the simulations with actual recordings. I'm going to discuss or explore what gets lost in the mock-up. Alongside this, I'm going to compose a set of etudes for the virtual orchestra. In these etudes, I will explore the things that I previously mentioned about creating unique aesthetics. Finally, I'll orchestrate these etudes for real orchestra. Does this lead to the discovery of new textures, timbres, or sonorities, at least on a personal level? Finally, how do I deal with unplayable passages? Even though I don't think this is likely, it would be great if I managed to expand an instrument's technical capacities. I think this is going to be more of an issue that's related to me on a personal level and perhaps my understanding of instruments, but I think it's going to be interesting to explore how I deal with these problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eliazer. I should mention that Eliazer is one of the composers in the core project as well. So had some interesting interactions along those lines. So anybody have any questions? Rand Steiger.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So thanks for the presentation. I've been doing renderings of chamber and even in orchestral music now for probably over 20 years because I'm always applying digital signal processing, and to develop my patches, I need to have a mock-up to develop signal processing before I go into the usually very limited rehearsal situation. And one of the things that I found really frustrating over the years is the fact that I'm putting in the data that represents my music in two completely different ways in a redundancy, one for notation and one in the DAW for mock-ups because of all the reasons that you've already explained. And obviously there's ways of transferring the data using standard MIDI files and things like that. But what I found is that to create convincing renderings, one needs to represent the music in a way that is very different than the way one represents it for notation purposes. And so I just wondered if you've thought about this problem and if you've come upon interesting potential or actual solutions that people have come up with to be able to only enter data representing music in one form, both for notation and for convincing virtual rendering.
I wish, because I find it extremely frustrating to, I'll be honest, I really hate writing in a sequencer. Because I'm just less experienced with it, and I'm trained with staff paper. Visually, it's different. I find that I don't know. I don't have any ideas at the moment, except that while sometimes it's faster to import the MIDI from the notation software, I find that one actually needs to play the instrumental lines in to get them to sound more musical. And then, of course, there are all sorts of adjustments that one needs to make to the actual music. But at this moment, at this early process in my research, I don't have any solutions or maybe even suggestions for that. But it is a really interesting point. Thank you for making it.
Rasul has a question.
Yeah. Actually, concerning the question which was asked recently, one of the things which I've seen being done is that the composers, well, they send the MIDI files to the orchestrator, but in that stage, they would actually clean up the MIDI files, send it like a secondary version of the same MIDI files that are messy because they had to do it like that in order to get a realistic sound. But just that visually it is easier for the orchestrator to note it down. That was that was just one of the things I've seen. But I wanted to ask about one of your conclusions, the fact that you're going to be using the virtual libraries, the sample libraries, in a way that they will sound bad. I mean, for instance, just like last week, Spitfire Audio released a new library that resolved to a large degree the problem of bow change when dealing with string runs. So the thing is that I want to understand more about the idea behind writing something for a specific library that we know it's going to fail. Because we also know that many of the libraries that are available today can do many things very good. So, what is exactly your goal?
So just a two-part answer. Yes, for the first part, absolutely. If you're going from MIDI to score, you absolutely need to clean up and quantize all the MIDI, or else it's very hard. For the second part, I don't know. I didn't mean that we should write things that will sound bad for the virtual orchestra. What I meant was that some things just don't sound as realistic for the virtual orchestra. One of those being fast runs or legato passages if you don't apply certain processes to it. And even then, they're not going to sound completely, at least with what I've been using, they're not going to sound completely convincing because they're missing a certain human element. The general idea of my project is to use the virtual orchestra to create an aesthetic that's unique to that of the real one, and hopefully one that sounds good, not bad. But absolutely, there's just some things that that don't sound convincing when playing into a virtual orchestra, and you just have to make certain adjustments to it. I'm not sure if that answers your question or.
No, it does. And I was wondering if you've ever experimented with layering physically modeled instruments, at least for solo instruments. I know like IRCAM has a set of instruments and many other companies with these sampled libraries to get a better sound, at least for the solo sections, because the ensembles will always sound a bit more natural compared to the solo parts.
And I didn't mention it in this presentation, but a big part of what I'm going to do is going to be experimenting both with different libraries, different articulations with libraries at the same time. If you have a string library playing legato and another one that's muted, how that affects the sound. Also with doing hybrid orchestrations. So there's going to be recordings of actual instruments and using the virtual orchestra to give it a bit of support. So those are definitely things that I'm going to be looking into. I couldn't really fit them into this presentation.
Okay, we have a question from Keith Hamill and then Roger Reynolds, and then maybe we'll get to Alex Taylor if we have time.
Yeah, thanks. It's really interesting. In terms of the concept of developing a new art form, I just wanted to mention that, of course, electroacoustic composers have been doing this kind of thing for a long time. Paul Dolden, for example, who lives in Montreal, has been what he used to do is record all the individual instruments one by one and then make multi-tracks that involved hundreds and hundreds of live recorded instruments. So it's interesting that the aesthetic is very similar, just the mechanism for creating it is different. But I did want to ask you whether you think, I mean, I often wonder whether, you know, when people are trying to distinguish between a virtual orchestra and a real orchestra, you know, most people actually hear orchestras through media. And so they're not really imagining real orchestras. They're imagining what they've heard on television or in films. Sometimes it's real, but a lot of the time it's not. And so there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy here that our concept of what the orchestra is gradually changes because of we're hearing synthetic orchestras. And the more we hear synthetic orchestras, the more we begin to think that that really is an orchestra. So I just wanted your comments on that.
I think that's a really interesting comment and also really relevant. And well, because I'm not trying to work on the most realistic replication of a real orchestra, that's definitely something I'm going to look into. But I'm kind of happy that it's not something that I have to focus on too much, because that sounds like a really, I mean, while it's very interesting, a really tough subject. But absolutely, and I hadn't really thought about that, and so thank you for mentioning that.
Roger.
Yeah, apologies for my dropout in the middle of a previous comment. So I just wanted to applaud this exploration that you're making between the imagined and the realizable. And I think that it's a really important fact that one can find boundary conditions or limitations to become features of a new kind of manifestation of one's ideas, one's imagination. And it always involves a kind of cost-benefit analysis, right? You foresee the possibility, you forehear the possibility of something very appealing, and you realize that there are very significant practical barriers between you and that experience, and also the difference between the experience itself and the facility with which one can exercise that, assuming that one does it once, doesn't then make it generally available. And so I think that one is constantly in that purgatorial situation of determining how much one is willing to spend in order to achieve the thing which has been imagined. And I think that all the things you're saying are intelligent and sensible, and I wish you well.
Thank you very much.
Okay, very quickly, Alex.
Yeah, I guess just similar to what Keith was saying, that sort of historically, I guess I'm thinking of people like Vangelis or Wendy Carlos, where they're using synthetic instruments that are very different from real sounding instruments. And I wonder, as technology gets more and more closer to what a real instrument sound like, whether the possibility for creating a distinct language out of these virtual instruments decreases, or is there a kind of uncanny valley between virtual sounds and real sounds? I guess I see that convergence as coming closer and closer to what real instruments sound like, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, just quickly, since there isn't much time, I think that absolutely, as sample libraries are becoming more realistic, they're also putting more limitations on the instruments without you having to modify them. So an instrument's range, for example, even possibly how loud it will go. I mean, you can obviously increase the volume of it, but just the fluctuations in timbre. So those are definitely issues that I need to focus on, because sort of the better libraries are, in a sense, for my project, both more limiting, but also better because I still want that orchestra sound, but just to modify it.
Thanks.
So thanks for your comment. I think you're mute. Okay. Thank you.